You know, it's been a little while since we checked in on Tyranny, just to see how it's doing. Welcome back to another episode of T-Rex Talk. This is Isaac Bodkin, and we're going to be talking a little bit about Tyranny. I did do a wellness check on Tyranny earlier this week, and well, unfortunately, it's doing fine. If you've been paying attention to the news, which, well, to be honest, you probably shouldn't, you will have come to roughly the same conclusion. And I want to look at two specifically different things and comment on a open source defense article today. One thing is what is happening in the UK right now. The other is just kind of the state of the United States presidential election. And we'll talk about how those things kind of interact. They're not exactly interacting at the moment, but they do reveal a couple of interesting things. So let's talk a little bit about what was going on in the UK. In the UK, there is a lot of strong talk from the government, from the Crown, not so much the King Charles III, but the Crown prosecutors and the police. The heads of the Metropolitan Police of London and of the entire UK have said that they're going to crack down on far-right thugs, who are basically, according to their own definition, anybody who is disappointed in how immigration is going, doesn't want any more immigration, or doesn't want immigrants to stab children with knives. There was a pretty rowdy riot that kicked off, but it kicked off because 3 children had been killed in a knife attack that also wounded a whole bunch of other people. And the government of the UK has cracked down on those rioters. There isn't even bail for the people who were part of the riot. There isn't even bail for the people who were watching the riot, because they are far-right thugs and they don't deserve basic protections of their rights. Now, this is very interesting because things are kind of devolving in the UK from I would say a law and order perspective, but the Crown and its prosecutors, its barristers and its solicitors and its bobbies, they have been engaged in, I would say, very transparently partial political prosecutions over the last several years. In the year 2020, the UK, particularly London and some of the larger boroughs, experienced significant rioting from Black Lives Matter, roughly at the same time that we were having riots over here. And the prosecutions in those cases were very low. The arrests were very low. The bail that was available to the people that had been arrested was very low. And the number of people who came to bail out these folks was very high. And so the end results of that were very few convictions and very few prison sentences. Within the last few years, things have changed a little bit, and now the shoe is a little bit on the other foot. And the justice response is incredibly different. There's a huge amount of very heavy-handed prosecution going on, and the point has been made that there will be zero tolerance for far-right thuggery and major intimidation campaigns from the different folks that have control. Not even sure exactly how things work in the UK. I understand how it works in the United States, who might run the Twitter account for a particular police department. But in the UK, I don't really understand. I know that you have your chief inspector, you have your various home secretaries telling them what to do, stuff like that. A very centralized police college, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But their Twitter account says, think before you post, because certain things are hate crimes if you post them on Twitter, or if you like them on Twitter, or if you meme incorrectly on a Twitter. So lots of preventative warnings. And I'm assuming at this point, lots of jokes. As the local constables go around, people are asking them, no luck catching them memers, that sort of thing. But this is really interesting what happened next. This is something that Americans have joked about, sort of prodded and trolled the Brits about how since 1776 we don't care about what they say. We understand that they don't have free speech like we do because 1776, et cetera, et cetera. But a lead prosecutor and the head of the London police mentioned that they will be able to and will possibly pursue the extradition of American citizens who have posted hate crimes on American Twitter in a way that British constabulary people can read, apparently. And this created a whole new wave of additional trolls and memes, because that's what Twitter is all about. So I may have mentioned that. I posted a couple of pictures of Cromwell. People responded in a very Twitter-like fashion, saying that it was time for everybody to start Cromwell maxing. In hindsight, I guess that's kind of funny. But this is a very interesting thing. The idea that the British government would have rules that go very much against their own common law system and various things that they have in their Bill of Rights. They don't have exactly a constitution, but they do have these legal traditions that they would go after hate crimes and argue that they still are upholding free speech, that free men of England are able to hold opinions and to speak them freely as long as they aren't certain opinions. The Crown and the various Home Secretary offices and Parliament and the constabulary have the ability to arrest people, deny them bail, and punish them really, really strictly for sharing the wrong memes, having the right ideas, or being present at the wrong types of protests. That is the idea that is emerging now, and that idea is being doubled down on so heavily that these rules are going to apply to foreigners who are outside the borders of the UK. Now, here's what's interesting about this next bit. Obviously, the Americans responded in kind, and there was lots of please try, I dare you, and stronger language. But here's the issue. What everybody imagines is that a bunch of helmeted bobbies, actually they don't wear helmets anymore, or a bunch of redcoats, actually they don't have redcoats anymore, are just going to come over here to the United States and politely knock on doors of law-abiding American citizens who have significant arsenals in their homes. And it's going to be 1776 all over again. But that's not actually how this would go. How this would go is the Home Secretary, or possibly the Foreign Secretary, again, it gets kind of fuzzy once you're over there, would call on various people inside of America's Department of Justice and would supply requests for certain people to be remanded and extradited and brought to the UK to face His Majesty's justice. At which point, the DOJ would decide whether or not they want to go to all the trouble of showing up at people's houses, raiding their homes, collecting them, and then extraditing them to this other place. And at that point, I think that it all depends on how big a deal you are, how annoying you have been to the Department of Justice to that point, or whichever regime is currently in power. At the moment, I think that the current regime is a little bit focused on the elections. But if, say, Harris-Walz administration is in power, it is very possible that the FBI would indeed raid some homes in order to arrest some people so that they could be sent to the UK to stand trial for the incredibly infamous crimes of liking the wrong memes. No luck catching them memers unless the DOJ helps out. That's the way that would actually go down. It wouldn't be powdered wigs and police helmets knocking on your door in rural Tennessee. That's the conversation that is being had around this particular issue. It is no longer as focused on immigration as it was last week. It is more circling around free speech and what freedom actually is, which brings me to the topic of actually today. I'm recording this on Monday. You'll get it tomorrow. But today's newsletter from Open Source Defense, the title of which was Tyranny is Here, but Not Evenly Distributed, which I think is a very good observation. America is probably the freest nation on the face of the earth, and yet there is tyranny here, but not evenly distributed. There are people, and we've talked about this in past episodes, people here in my county who have been raided by the FBI for offending the current administration. Guns drawn, doors not exactly kicked in. They were more polite than that. But these are the kind of political prosecutions that are happening now. They're not evenly distributed, and there's plenty of people who can assume, probably correctly, that this kind of persecution isn't actually going to come to their door. And so we can look around at all the freedoms that we do have, which are many compared even to London and Birmingham. And we can assume that we are still a free nation, even though tyranny is here, just unevenly distributed and somewhat arbitrarily applied. Now, the point that open source defense was making refers kind of to this idea that we have. We've talked about it a lot, and it is a very true statement that the Second Amendment protects the First Amendment. Your freedom to speak, your freedom to hold opinions, your freedom to comment on things is very much supported by your freedom to back those ideas up through force of arms. Your idea to be free to defend yourself and your ideas if you are challenged by lethal force or illegal force from other means. And this idea is that in the United States, part of the reason that we haven't seen the same level of control and the same level of tyranny as some other Western nations is because our population is armed. It has retained its arms in a way that European civilizations largely have not. We could argue a little bit about Austria. We could argue a little bit about Switzerland, places that do have more permissive gun laws. But America undeniably has a better armed population and a wider appreciated Second Amendment that goes into a lot more detail about why Americans cannot have their arms removed from them. So this idea from open source defense is that it isn't so much the physical guns as the idea that has created a cultural barrier stopping the erosion of the First Amendment any more than it's already been eroded. And they make this point, which I think is very well made. You would assume that because America has more people who are armed and well armed in their own homes, that is the reason that police officers are not willing to kick down doors and arrest people for mean tweets or liking the wrong memes. But this is very interesting. They point out that in the it's actually, I'd love to know what the Irish figures are, but within England and Wales, within that one particular island, there were only 2 people shot and killed by police officers in the year 2022, and that number was way, way higher in the United States, over 1,000 people. Now, obviously, the populations are different between the UK and the United States, but once you adjust for population, Americans are 69 times more likely to be shot by police than Britishers and people that live in the British Isles. The armed raids that we have in this country are conducted even against people who are specifically known to be armed. So it isn't the fear of the weapons that make us more free from these kind of things. A great example of this would be the gentleman that we talked about several episodes ago. He was the executive director of the Arkansas or the Little Rock airport in Arkansas. Brian Malinowski, I believe was his name. His home was raided by the ATF specifically because he had weapons. They conducted the raid without body cams after disabling his security cameras, so there's no record of exactly what happened, but his arms did not keep them from raiding him at 4 a.m. They didn't go and get him at the airport where he was going to be unarmed for sure. They busted into his home where he was going to be armed for sure, and he was killed. So he is one of that statistic, over 1,000 people killed by police officers in the United States, considerably higher than the UK. So if the firearms themselves are not the deterrent that they seem to be or that we think they are, what is the deterrent? Why is it that America has hung on to its First Amendment rights, even if the Second Amendment rights are not really seen in use, being used practically all the time? And that is an idea. This idea that if you have a weapon, if you have these Second Amendment rights, along with them come some responsibilities. The culture that comes along with the ownership of weapons and the understanding that that is an unalienable right is one that will cause people to push back against the removal of other unalienable rights. It is that culture of the Second Amendment that is really so far been the largest impediment, the largest barrier to a lot of our freedoms being taken away, at least in such an overt way. I think that one of the ways that we can see how a lot of our freedoms were infringed upon in the past is Twitter. Twitter is just bonkers right now. At the time of this recording, Elon Musk and Donald Trump just had a conversation on Twitter. And prior to this taking place, there was a huge amount of furor. There were reporters asking the White House press secretary if there was any way that this could be stopped, if there was any way that the White House could intervene, if there was any way that the government could prevent this from happening, because surely misinformation would be the result and it would be terrible. The EU wrote a very strongly worded letter to Donald Trump, which I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially went into a lot of detail into the terrible things that would happen to Twitter if they were to interview Donald Trump. There's significant legal obligations, apparently, according to the EU, that bind Elon Musk and X. I guess we should stop calling it Twitter because Elon Musk owns it and has renamed it X. X must not be trafficking in misinformation. And Donald Trump talking to Elon Musk is almost assuredly going to be misinformation because, after all, it is two of the most hated people on Earth discussing things together with no controls over them, no filters, nobody censoring them with every other word. So the way that this is playing out is really interesting to me. This argument over free speech, which at the moment is revolving around Twitter, and strangely enough, revolving around Elon Musk and Donald Trump, is pretty fascinating. And I think that we kind of missed how much control there actually was inside of some of these social media platforms and inside of the media until 2020, when there was a huge amount of actual censorship of misinformation, medical misinformation. It's okay to revoke people's free speech and their First Amendment rights if the misinformation is of a medical nature. That's what we decided. But now that X is no longer Twitter, and X is no longer run by regular Silicon Valley folks that bend the knee to Washington, D.C., we're seeing a lot more information come out. We're seeing a lot more conversation go on. And there's a huge amount of froth. There's a huge amount of discussion about what is going on in the UK that is just memes and goofy conversation about George Washington and Oliver Cromwell and Cromwell maxing and the ratio of Charleses that have been decapitated by the British people is rather low. That was actually kind of funny. I've heard that one a couple of places. This idea that information will be free and can be free is playing out on X. And the response to that is really interesting. I wish that the quality of discourse were higher, although I'm probably not helping because I keep posting Cromwell pictures. I wish that the level of conversation and the level of rigor was a little higher there. But what's fascinating is the sheer fear and horror that is displayed by reporters inside of White House press briefings, talking about how there must be some way for the White House, there must be some way for the Department of Justice, for the American government to step in and stop Donald Trump from having a conversation with Elon Musk in public, because the information that is revealed in that conversation will be damaging to democracy. You know, even though Donald Trump is technically running for president. I wonder if some reporters have forgotten about that. They forgot that he survived an assassination attempt recently, so it's possible that they forgot that he is running for president. Now, I mentioned that we're going to talk about two aspects of tyranny. We're going to talk about, and we kind of have covered everything that I had to say about the censorship over on the UK side, this demand that information be controlled and that thoughts be controlled, even thinking about certain things. There was a clip that was going around, again, on Twitter, or possibly X. Actually, no, it was Twitter, because this was weeks and weeks ago. British police inspectors, or possibly officers, official vocab guidelines kind of escape me, were interviewing a lady who was standing on the sidewalk near an abortion clinic. She was not obstructing. She was in a public place, but she was near the abortion clinic. They were investigating her and trying to discover if she had in fact been praying silently in her own head, because that is prohibited. The sanctity of the abortion clinic must be preserved at all costs. So, yeah, the thought police are actually walking the streets of London at the moment. But over here in America, we don't have that. We do have secretaries asking if the White House can shut down free speech on X, on Twitter. And I feel like there's a level of betrayal that they're feeling there, because Twitter used to be one of their most protected, safe spaces where the blue check marks were given only to those people who were loyal to the regime. Twitter was one of the earliest and one of the safest spaces for the liberal intelligentsia. And now Elon Musk, who is a rogue character, He shouldn't be on the side of the people because he is a billionaire and he has bought Twitter and he has turned it into a place where there will be no obedience to rules that are made by the government that violate the First Amendment. There will only be upholding of the First Amendment by a private website. And that is deeply, deeply troubling to some people. And one of the ways that you can see that it is troubling is as it plays out in the election. There's been very, very little coverage of Donald Trump since the assassination attempt. I mean, if you were even pretending to be a journalist, you had to cover that story. It was pretty big news. We haven't had an assassination attempt on a president or a presidential candidate in about 40 years, so it definitely deserved a little bit of attention for a day, 2 or 3 days, but now it is something in the past. The big news now is that Kamala Harris is having her moment, and everybody is just incredibly invigorated and inspired by her. Not by any speeches, she hasn't really given any, not by any interviews, she hasn't really given any, but just by her mere presence. She has selected a running mate and they have shown up at a bunch of events, and little tiny clips of some of these speeches have sort of leaked out, and giant throngs of people just celebrating her sheer moment and that she has now been unburdened by what has been is something that the media just cannot get enough of. Remember that this is somebody who has not received any votes in the primary, didn't have any delegates. This was somebody who was incredibly uninspiring the last time that she actually had to debate other candidates. This is somebody who has yet to do anything that is really meaningful or comment on any particular policies besides abortion. She does want to have unlimited abortions available. And she did come out with another policy position recently, which was no taxes on tips, which sounds very much like a Donald Trump position. And now that I think about it, in 2022, she is the person who made tips taxable in the first place. And now one of her only policy positions is that if she is made president, they won't be taxable. You know, she's in office right now. She could make this change. But she is somebody who has pushed for 87,000 new IRS inspectors who will be able to go out and collect taxes on tips. And now this is one of her campaign positions. And her running mate, Walz, has some of his merchandise. It's not a red hat that says Make America Great Again, but it is a camouflage hat. There's as much picking and choosing and trying to benefit off of Donald Trump's supporters and positions and image and brand as possible, while still making him out to be literally Hitler. The fact that the media is on board with this and is troubled with the only platform that has any sort of pushback, which is Elon Musk and X, reveals the other half of the tyranny that I think that we can see now. Just the sheer fact that the media and the donor class and various folks like this can create a candidate, not quite out of thin air, because we've had Kamala Harris around for a while, but create passion and create interest and create excitement and create fervor, definitely out of thin air, is troubling. And it's troubling a lot of people on the internet. But the only place where you can really see them speak freely is Twitter, is X. So this debate over tyranny and free speech is going to rage. And I think things are going to get pretty interesting over the next couple of months. Last week, people were freaking out about the stock market crashing. And to be fair, it did lose trillions of dollars worth of value. And now we have all this other stuff going on in the UK. There's going to be more riots. There's going to be more unrest. There's going to be more calls for control over those unrestful people. This is just going to keep happening. And a lot of people are asking, is it time for World War III? Stuff is going on in the Ukraine and Russia space. There are currently counterattacks going on now that seem surprisingly effective. And of course, there are people who are protesting that Donald Trump and various other folks are connected to Russia. New articles are always coming out, but they always feature the exact same allegations. Christopher Steele is back, making allegations that Elon Musk is connected to Russia now. Or if he hasn't made that allegation, he will by the time you see this podcast. So there will always be wars and rumors of wars. Tyranny and real tyranny being applied effectively in some areas, less effectively in others, but threatened everywhere. Should you panic? No. Should you do something? Well, I would argue that you should do Nothing beyond the stuff that you should be doing already anyway. The things that are necessary to preserve a nation, to preserve a republic. They're necessary both in peacetime and in war. They're necessary both in times of plenty and in famine, and in times of unrest and in peace and tranquility and unity. So, building into your communities is going to be vital, whether World War III is on the horizon or whether it's just going to be more riots. One of the reasons that the UK is able to act so heavy-handedly when it comes to some of these new rules about who should be prosecuted and who shouldn't is that the police are a lot more centralized. The United States is large enough, not just populous enough, but geographically large enough that we still have more decentralization than a lot of European countries. And what that means is even our police forces can be more decentralized. Part of this is geographic, but part of this is by design. The way that our political system is set up, we have police officers and we have sheriffs that are not exactly opposed. They are cooperating in their jobs, but they are separate departments with separate jurisdictions for a reason. And you have a greater ability to know the people on your local sheriff's department and your local police departments, and larger, more centralized systems like in the UK, where every Bobby goes to the same police college and receives the same trainings. In the States, we have a lot of different police academies. There are ways that power have been centralized in the UK in the parliamentary system where we have them broken apart. There are more checks and balances here, but they have to be taken advantage of. You should be getting involved with your local elections. You should be getting involved with your sheriff, your police departments. You should be knowing these people because they are part of your community. That makes it far easier for you to actually have the sorts of conversations in person that are increasingly disallowed online. These are the sorts of things that you should be doing, again, in times of peace and in times of turmoil, and building the kinds of capabilities that are important in all of these different times. I do really appreciate that open source defense article. The culture that comes from responsible firearm ownership for a purpose, the purpose of upholding rights and fulfilling responsibilities, cannot be overstated. But the hardware also helps. Getting the hardware into people's hands is sometimes the first step to having those serious conversations and those deeper convictions about the responsibilities. And sometimes it goes the other way. So the conversations and the training should both be going on at the same time. Building out some of those capabilities, building out your communities, having a better idea of what's going on when it is obvious. I mean, they're not even trying to hide it now. It is obvious that reporters are trying to hide things from you, like Elon Musk, the richest man alive. His opinions should be hidden from you. Donald Trump, a guy running for office in a country where we only really have two-party elections. One of the parties should not be allowed to speak to you. Like, this is pretty bold-faced stuff, really, when you think about it. In those instances, a better grasp on reality and a better capability to speak to your friends and neighbors is pretty important. So these are the things that we should be developing. But at the same time, you shouldn't take your eye off of the ball. We should be watching what is happening in Europe. We should be watching what is happening in the UK specifically. We should be offering whatever kind of aid that we can. So keep building into those communities and those capabilities, which we've talked about quite a bit. And then this is also, I would think, pretty well-trod T-Rex talk territory, but be reading books. The sources of information today are all kind of suspect. Even X is full of all kinds of crazy argumentation from people who apparently don't know better, talking about history that they've never read. The history is really vital, especially the history of Britain. If you actually want to know what the founders of England meant when they wrote certain things and said certain things, if you want to know what the laws on the books used to be, what the intent of the original monarchs, if you want to know how the first English Civil War went in the 1650s so that you can understand the later things, you're not going to be able to get that from the BBC. You're not going to be able to get that from official channels who are rewriting the history even as we speak. You're going to need to go back to books. You're going to be able to read about people like King Alfred the Great, who we've talked about on previous episodes. You're going to be able to read about Oliver Cromwell in that first Civil War and the new model army that he raised in order to have some sort of understanding for what is actually true about British history, in the same way that you need to read the words of the founders to understand what they meant by the First and Second Amendments. These need to be things that you're familiar with and that you understand so that you can really know what reality is in a time when it's being bent and shaped and banned from conversation. So, as you build into your communities and you build those capabilities, also build true understanding so that you have the kind of discernment that you're going to need as these things continue to play out. So again, as you watch all of this happening, as you watch tyranny as it begins to be a little more consistently applied, a little more heavy-handed and delivered to a lot more people, freedoms being revoked and punishments getting far more severe, you got to go back and you got to know the history so that you have real context for what is going on. And you need to be building in your communities. What you do as a reaction to what is happening today should be nothing, because you've already started doing it. And it is the kind of work that needs to be done consistently and constantly throughout human history to build civilization. That is the key. So get on those books. And actually, you know what? I'm going to tell you, get on Twitter. It's really fascinating to see some of this happen. And there's Cromwell memes that need to be written.